doctoral fellows, and we also have graduate research associates and undergraduate research associates, and we had 2 of our graduate research associates with us, and I know we have 1 left, so Wei, we just want to say hello and thank you for joining us as well. Earlier, Aram was asking me, he's like, Derrick, what's the pin? What's this lapel pin that you're wearing? So this is, last week I was in Geneva at the World Summit on the Information Society Forum, the WSIS Forum, to celebrate 15 years of the WSIS. So how many of you went to WSIS? Wow. How many of you know what WSIS stands for? Okay, that's a little better. Great. So it was pretty nostalgic for me being back in the same rooms where we had our prep comms and negotiations, for WSIS leading up to the World Summit on the first part of the World Summit on the Information Society. And so I thought as a testament to that, I would wear the pin. But I also wanted to talk about, what came out of the WSIS. So we know that the Global Alliance on ICT and Development was one of the 2 multi-stakeholder governance institutions that came out of WSIS, but also the Internet Governance Forum, which also last week had the multi-stakeholder advisory group meeting. And if you look at the Internet Governance Forum, you can see the rise of discussions of the Internet of Things over the last 12 years of the life of the IGF. And so this is something that is very important for us. Some of you may have seen the book that I wrote on transnational advocacy networks in the Information Society that really talks about the WSIS process and the IGF and the GATE. One of the other interesting developments that has come out of, so Laura and Nanette and I have a new book that we're working on Internet governance research methods. And the chapter that I'm presenting, that I just told Laura this morning, I finished with my chapter, presenting a draft of it next week in San Francisco at the International Studies Association annual meeting. So my chapter looks at big data analytics and text mining. And so I've been text mining the IGF. And I know Samantha Bradshaw is with us. She's doing computational news at the Oxford Internet Institute. So really happy to have her here. She's working with Phil Howard and others that are there. So really exciting. So Samantha, thank you for joining us. And so as I've looked at the 12 years of data for the IGF, there's some incredibly interesting findings. As I said, one is that the IGF Internet of Things discussion has really increased. But one of the things that surprised me the most is that there was an early and sustained focus on disability and accessibility within the IGF as well, much higher than I would have thought it would have been, which was great to me because we do focus on thinking about disability rights and policy within these global spaces. And I want to bring some of those ideas of accessibility into this panel as well. So this panel is going to really think about some of the privacy issues, some of the inclusion issues related to the Internet of Things. We know that this is a global market. It's expected to reach 7.1 trillion by the year 2020, with implications for various segments of our economy and of society, from farming and healthcare, transportation, manufacturing, and many, many others. It's also related to smart cities, so increasing use of Internet of Things devices and smart city sensors around the world. There's been several large-scale implementation of Internet of Things in cities, so in Korea, Spain, Singapore, and others. And so we also can think about the data that is coming from all of these devices that are collecting data and sharing that data with each other, and sometimes the unexpected releases of that data as well. So these are some issues that are very challenging for us as we move forward, and I'm just really delighted that we have such an excellent panel with us. So we have 3 panelists. We have one panelist that is remote, as we did on the morning session. There he is, Cory Docterow. So what we're going to do is I will introduce Cory. He'll then speak. And then, Andrew, I think then I'll introduce the other panelists. They'll speak. Then we'll take all of Cory's questions first, and then we'll have an interactive discussion with the other panelists. I think is the way Andrew wants us to do it. So without further ado, let me introduce Cory Docterow. So I'm really excited about this. A lot of the podcasts that I listen to, I've never gotten a chance to meet Cory, but he's been on a lot of the podcasts that I listen to. He's a famous science fiction writer. So Cory is a special consultant to the Electronic Frontier Foundation's Apollo 1201 project. The goal of this project is to kill all DRM in the world within a decade. Very, very ambitious goal, Cory. He holds an honorary doctorate in computer science from the Open University, where he's a visiting professor. He's also a research associate at the MIT Media Lab. And as I said, he's a best-selling science fiction novelist and the co-owner editor of boingboing.net, a popular, long-standing technology and culture news site. So without further ado, let me turn you over to Cory Docterow.
Hi, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Hi. So I want to talk about the relationship between surveillance, DRM, privacy, and economic fairness as it relates to policy questions and some fundamental business questions. So the first assertion I want to make is that it's hard to imagine an IoT business model that is based around actually selling people gadgets. The base margin for hardware starts at about 2%. It falls very quickly if you're popular, because once you're popular, you're knocked off in the Far East, and margins can actually go negative, especially if your suppliers in the Far East start running third shifts and then selling your own product out the back door. And so if you're going to raise the capital for something as capital intensive as making millions of gadgets that you're going to hope to put in people's houses, you need to promise your investors that you're going to get your money somewhere other than selling people stuff. And inevitably, that's about controlling how people use the stuff and mining their habits as they use this stuff in order to extract additional revenue. So you might say, well, we're going to spy on our users and gather data that other people can't get about some part of their lives that could be monetized by selling it to data brokers or using it in marketing. We're going to use some kind of lock-in to ensure that they only buy a consumable from us. So, in 3D printing land, many 3D How about now? Can you hear me? I think what I did was I whacked the button that turned off my mic. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Sure, yeah. And over in 3D printing land, there are these single-use print head add-ons that perform no meaningful technical function, but the machine checks to make sure you've put a new one in every time you start a new job, and they're expensive. And they exist simply as a way, they're like a token to prove to the manufacturer that you've arranged your affairs to the benefit of their shareholders instead of to your own affairs. You might want to lock in the service components, service side of things, so you might have some kind of check where anyone performing service or getting diagnostic information out of a device needs to demonstrate to the device that you've paid some Daingeld, that you've offered some money to the manufacturer for the privilege of being an authorized service center, or that you are the manufacturer. And they may try to create a monopoly on components. You can build a component so that when it's put in the device, it doesn't register until the device performs a cryptographic handshake with it to safeguard the fact that it's come from the original manufacturer and not from a third party that's marking it down. Often this is posed as an anti-counterfeiting measure, with the idea that a customer of yours would never knowingly avail themselves of a cheaper version of a component that you have a high markup on, and that they've been tricked by someone who's made a counterfeit. But in practice, it's more often used against service centers and against individuals, customers, who knowingly go out and buy a cheaper alternative in the belief that they found something that's just as good. And none of these are, as a technical matter, particularly hard to defeat. I'm not going to go into the computer science at great length, although maybe if anyone's interested, we can talk about that in the Q&A. But as a general matter, in computer science, we know how to make computers that can run every program, but we don't know how to make computers that can run every program except for some one that the manufacturer doesn't like. And so if there's a program that would override the checking, it will run on the computer. And so there's no practical way to stop users and competitors from modifying their devices, reconfiguring their devices, so the devices respect their wishes instead of confounding their wishes to the benefit of the manufacturer. So instead, we turn to policy in order to make this happen. And the two major areas of policy where we accomplish this kind of lock-in, or these kinds of market advantages for original manufacturers, is through the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is a very broad anti-hacking statute that was actually passed in the wake of a news panic after Matthew Broderick starred in the 1984 movie War Games. And it very broadly defines hacking, illegal hacking, as doing anything that exceeds your authorization on a system that you don't own. And so in practice, we often see violating terms of service as being framed as an illegal form of hacking, a felonious form of hacking that can result in prison time. And since the terms of service ban you from, say, logging into the server to say, I swear that this component is real, when in fact it's a third-party component, any device that helps you put a third-party component in your gadget and get it running again would require potential CFAA violation. And the other area is in the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, Section 1201, which is the anti-circumvention element of it, that almost without exception, in fact, without any meaningful exception, bars bypassing any system that restricts access to a copyrighted work. And when this was born in 1988 in the Clinton administration, it was mostly used in entertainment contexts. It was to stop you from like reconfiguring your DVD player to play DVDs that you bought abroad. There's not much kind of anti-piracy nexus there, like going to Mexico or India and buying a DVD that the rights holder has authorized at the price that the rights holder asked is like the actual literal non-hyperbolic opposite of piracy, right? Paying a copyright owner the money that they ask for the work and then watching it is not piracy. But the fact that they wanted to segment their markets meant that unless they could come up with some extra legal means, some means that wasn't in their enumerated statutory rights, stopping you from going to Mexico or going to India and buying a lower cost DVD and bringing it home, they would be stymied in those market segmentation efforts. But a funny thing happened on the way to the 21st century, which is that software is copyrighted, and so anything with software in it has a copyrighted work inside of it. And so if you design your device so that using it in ways that the manufacturer disprefers requires bypassing some lock on the firmware, then you potentially violate Section 1201 of the DMCA, and that carries a $500,000 fine and a 5-year prison sentence for a first offense for commercial offenses. So anyone making a tool and distributing it to third parties to use in this way, or offering service to reconfigure people's devices for them. And so this has created this enormous, powerful incentive for firms to lock in their devices and to avail themselves of the DMCA and CFAA to protect that lock-in. And it's had a second order effect that's really meaningful to privacy questions and questions of information security. So in order to conduct routine information security audits of a device to find out whether or not it works, you generally have to be able to spoof it. You have to be able to throw random input at it. You have to be able to examine and decompile its firmware. You have to be able to do all the kinds of things that the CFAA and the DMCA 1201, generally speaking, prohibit. And this has produced this enormous chilling effect on security research, which is really problematic. It's also pretty clear that the industry views this as a feature and not a bug. There's a new organization that was created by the various tech manufacturers to fight the so-called right to repair bills that are pending in many states right now, called the Security Innovation Center, and their members are made up of like CompTIA, CTIA, TechNet, the Consumer Technology Association. And they've just published a set of principles enumerating what they think policymakers should do in order to create a kind of good outcome for their customers. And one of them is that the public disclosure of information about product alterations should be weighed against the public interest of choice, consumer security, privacy, and intellectual property protection. And as they enumerate that, what they make clear is that they believe that someone who knows a true fact about defects in a product that customers are relying on should not be allowed to disclose that true fact except in accordance with whatever arbitrary guidelines the manufacturer sets out. That the manufacturer should effectively have a veto and become the custodian of bad news about their products that could affect their sales and their share price. And so this is not good policy on its face. If anyone should be the custodian of the truth about defects in products, which is something that I don't think there should be, but even if we're going to say someone should be in charge of who gets to know about defects in products, I think it's really clear that manufacturers are not well suited to have that authority. Those manufacturers have a long history of using law and other techniques to suppress information about defects in their products. And one of the things that we know empirically is that suppression of disclosure doesn't lead to a failure to exploit, right? If you never tell anyone about the defect you discovered, it doesn't mean that someone else won't discover it and exploit it. And the most ardent practitioners of secrecy in vulnerability discovery are the spy agencies. The NSA, the CIA, and so on. They routinely discover vulnerabilities or buy discovered vulnerabilities from the security industry and then cover them up so that they can weaponize them and exploit them. And with the leaks of these cyber weapons, the Vault 7, the Vault 8, and the Shadow Brokers leaks, we've been able to go back in time and say, okay, well, here's where we have this cyber weapon the NSA developed based on this defect that they discovered and didn't tell the manufacturer about. How long until we saw that being exploited in the wild by a bad guy who independently rediscovered it? And it's about 20% per year. So any defect that the most sophisticated attacker discovers has about a 20% per year chance of being rediscovered in the years that come by bad guys who will then go on and exploit them. And so this is bad policy because it means that these vulnerabilities, they fester, they become exploited, and they only get disclosed not when they're discovered, but once they're so widely exploited that they can't be denied anymore. And even companies that want to do the right thing, once you give them these legal weapons to punish people who have bad news about their products, they can't seem to let go of them. So Dropbox, just the day before their IPO, they released these really excellent security guidelines that they said would serve as a template for companies that wanted to create responsible disclosure programs. But in those was their fourth clause, which is they said it's a pledge that we won't use the DMCA against a security researcher, provided that that researcher doesn't break our policies. So they're still saying that they should have a veto, but they're saying that that veto should be exercised responsibly. And again, I think it's hard to argue in a country that has the First Amendment that it should be illegal to tell the truth about someone's products, even if they would prefer that you not tell the truth about the defects of their products. So this is spread to all the devices that have DRM, which is to some approximation all the devices that are in the Internet of Things. And even where it's not present in the Internet of Things directly, it's largely present in the control surfaces. So the World Wide Web Consortium is an open standards body that makes standards for the web. It was founded with the founding of the web by Tim Berners-Lee when he invented the web. And for 2.5 decades, they only made open standards that enhanced user control over the web. But Netflix threatened to boycott the web itself and only release videos for apps. And they were followed by a bunch of large rights holder organizations, unless the W3C would standardize a proprietary DRM that would be illegal to reverse engineer, illegal to make open source alternatives to, and illegal to find, to report defects on. And they claimed that that was all a side effect, that all they wanted was to make the DRM work, and that these were all just side effects that were incidental to it. And so the W3C members from the nonprofit sector, from disability rights groups, and from cryptocurrency and information security land, we got together and we made a proposal that members who participated in DRM standard setting should promise not to invoke Section 1201 of the DMCA against people doing security research. And the industrial actors in the W3C absolutely categorically refused to consider this in any way, shape, or form. And in the end, this W3C standard called encrypted media extensions was published with no protections for security research. And these sophisticated HTML5 web applications are designed to control the Internet of Things. So even where it's not in the gadget, it's in the control surface. And now we have 3 billion browsers that have unauditable attack surfaces that can be used to exploit users, to undermine their privacy, and so on. And this is not going to get better in the foreseeable future. The world that we live in is effectively made up of computers now. And we have computers inside our bodies, and we put our bodies inside of computers. Your artificial pancreas, your voting machine, and your tractor are respectively a computer you put in your body, a computer that we put democracies inside of, and a computer that our food security rests on. And these are all devices that are already encumbered with DRM. And every 3 years, the Copyright Office has these hearings where they entertain suggestions for creating exceptions to these rules. But by their own admission, their exceptions can't allow products, only uses that you might make of such a product. So what they say is, we might grant an exception allowing a farmer to fix their own tractor, but that farmer needs to get an advanced degree in computer science and make their own John Deere tractor firmware patching tool, because no one else is allowed to make or provide them with that tool. So in practice, these are very hollow moral victories that achieve not much beyond getting into the evidentiary record, an admission by the administrative branch that there's overreach in this legislation, but they can't, practically speaking, correct that. Now, at Electronic Frontier Foundation, we're trying to correct this. We are representing two clients, Matthew Green from Johns Hopkins University and Andrew Bunny Wang from MIT, in a lawsuit that challenges the constitutionality of Section 1201. It's been going for more than a year now. We're still waiting for the court to rule on a standing question. The court is well overdue. We don't know when we'll hear back from them. But we think that this is at least one path to establishing balance. And in the meantime, I think that the approach that we've taken is the right one, that we don't know how to make things work. We don't know which code computer scientists should write to make IoT devices that respect your privacy, that resist hacking, and so on. But we know how to make sure that they can't do it. We know how to get it wrong. And the way to get it wrong is to make it illegal to tell people when they've made mistakes, to make it illegal to warn people when the technologies that they rely on are inadequate or are not good candidates for their trust, to make it illegal for third parties to try and remediate the errors that firms have made, to suppress reports of vulnerabilities and defects, to incentivize companies to add this lock-in technology as a means of shoring up their business models. In every regard, the policy framework that we have now is seemingly devised to make failure as graceless as possible. And I think that if there's one thing we should all be able to agree on is like a minimum viable agreement for good policy in an IoT future, it's that we should be designing things so that when they fail, we know about it quickly and we can try to fix it. Thanks for your time.
Great. Cory, that was really exciting, so thank you very much for that. I'm going to minimize him. Okay. All right. Bye-bye, Cory. We'll bring you back. Is that Ash? Hi, Ash. So that was really exciting, Cory. Thank you very much. So our next speaker on the panel is Tatevik, Dr. Tatevik Sargsyan. Pretty close?
Yes,
okay.
That's good.
So Tatevik is a senior research fellow in the Ranking Digital Rights project at the New America Foundation. She's working on RDR's Digital ID project and company research for the 2018 index. So her work on consumer reports is in this area. She holds a PhD from American University's School of Communication. I was going to give you my second hat there, where her work revolved around privacy and the privatization of public digital sphere. She serves as an adjunct professor at American University and teaches courses on the social impact of information and communication technologies. Previously, Tatevik served as a Google Policy Fellow for the Global Network Initiative and conducted policy analysis on privacy and freedom of expression. Her research has been featured in academic journals such as the International Journal of Communication and Internet Policy Review. It's also been featured in the book that Laura, Nanette, and Francesca and I edited. So Tatevik had a chapter in that book as well. And she's a fellow at the Internet Law and Policy Foundry, a collaborative platform for early career Internet law and policy professionals. So without further ado, Tatevik.
You want me there? Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Thank you so much for actually having me on this panel. I'm delighted to be back here. As you know, I do love the Internet Governance Lab. So yes, my name is Tatevik Sargsyan, and I'm a senior research fellow at Ranking Digital Rights. Ranking Digital Rights is housed at New America. It's a research initiative that sets global standards for how companies in the ICT sector should respect human rights. We produce a project called Corporate Accountability Index, and that ranks global companies, mobile telecommunication and internet companies, on how they perform on privacy and freedom of expression. So we look at their disclosures and public policies to evaluate them. We rank 22 companies. Is my PowerPoint not up? All right, let's see. I see it. I will get it, I think. All right, do you want to help me? Yes. So besides that, Ranking Digital Rights also works on a different project that is called the Digital Standard. Some of you might have heard about it. Yeah, so I'm going to talk mostly about the Digital Standard. So the Digital Standard is a project that we're involved in, and it's a collaborative project with Consumer Reports and a few other organizations. We helped develop the Digital Standard, which is essentially a list of criteria of privacy and security. It reflects a lot of the classic consumer values in security and privacy, and best practices in encryption, security oversight, security vulnerability programs like software, some technical software-related things that I'm not necessarily an expert on, but we have a technical team that does the work on that, as well as very essential privacy best practices in the area of data collection, data retention, data sharing, and transparency. So if you're interested, you can go to the digitalstandards.org, and you can see the details of all the criteria that are included in the digital standards and all the indicators. So the goal of the digital standard, it was created to actually give consumer organizations a tool, an effective tool to assess internet-connected devices or IoT devices. So that they can write and report on the products that are, coming up in the various industries and inform users so that users can make smarter choices. It's also, one of the other goals is also to kind of help companies provide them with a roadmap of how to design products, as well as what sorts of policy considerations to have. Especially when we're talking about companies that don't have the resources to already do that. So it's a very essential tool. So besides being involved in the development of the digital standard, we also have an ongoing collaborative research project with Consumer Reports. And since September of last year, 2017, we've been evaluating various product categories in the Internet of Things. And I think I evaluated about probably 15, 16 IoT products. And when I say I've been evaluating, I mean I'm evaluating products based on their publicly disclosed policies, like privacy policies, governance documents, as well as the privacy controls that you can see from the product's interface. So that's what I do, but Consumer Reports has also partnered with another organization called Disconnect, and they are engineers and they do the technical testing of the same products. And in the end, we collect all the information together and we produce results to help consumers. So you may have heard our first findings were actually regarding smart TVs, and Consumer Reports published it in February. So two interesting highlights from the findings is that two of the TV models that we've tested, Samsung and TCL, that were operated with the Roku streaming platform, had vulnerabilities that could allow hackers to actually take control of the TV remotely and change the channels, change the volume, and do some other things, but not necessarily to steal information or spy on users. So that was one of the findings. The second essential one was that we all know that all these TVs collect a lot of user information, and they do give users some sort of controls that you can turn off or opt out of. But interestingly, when you do that in some of the TVs, you actually lose the smart functionality, which is not a good practice when you're talking about IoT devices. So That's a little bit about the work that we do. So I want to talk about also in our role in this conversation about governance. You know, when we talk about governance, understandably, we know that companies already govern this space, you know, by their design decisions, by their policy approaches, operational approaches. So where we see our role, or the role of such projects as the digital standard or the corporate accountability index, is that we are trying to actually encourage the companies to do the right things, to have better design decisions or policy decisions so that users' rights such as privacy, sometimes freedom of expression, but also security are protected. And the way we approach the issue is from various avenues, right? So one way is if you're equipping consumer organizations to use standards like these to actually evaluate the products, then you're basically leveraging the reputation of the companies, right? You shine light on poor performance, and you're also rewarding the good performance of the companies by, you know, positive media attention. So it's been working. I think in other projects we've seen progress. The standard is slightly new to actually be able to tell what the impact is. That's one avenue. Another avenue is actually encouraging users to actually make the right choices, especially if we're talking about areas and industries where there is variety and there is competition. So, giving them the right information can and may have an impact on what sort of products they may choose and create more competition in the market. Another one is also through investors, right? So if we can encourage responsible investors to actually invest in the sorts of companies that protect users' rights, that's also another avenue that we fit into this governance conversation. So that's what we tried to do, and I think that Corporate Accountability Index actually has been pretty successful. If you look at the results that we published in 2015 and 2017, you can see like a progress that companies have been making. But again, we don't know that about the standard yet, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be very similar. But I want to talk also about some of the challenges that we face, I face, or projects like this will face when working in this IoT space. First of all, one of the important things that I do at work is, besides assessing and writing reports, is also determining how well the standard works for evaluations. Like, what are the gaps when you're approaching different sorts of products? Are the standards good for measuring what you're trying to measure, or should there be more criteria and standards to actually account for the added risks and some of the vulnerabilities that we've been hearing today? So, how do you define accountability in different industries? Because every single company now is sort of a technology company, but they operate in very different spaces with different regulatory approaches. So, like, how do you come up with criteria where you can measure that? Another challenge at my work is this idea that the IoT has such complex ownership structure and also such complex supply chain structure. So if you're looking at a manufacturer and you're looking at privacy control, you're really only capturing one company's practices, when in reality there are multiple companies down the road where also are affecting. So trying to get the companies to do due diligence of privacy and security in their supply chain, and then figuring out what the right disclosures and policies should be around that, that we can inform users and ensure that users have trust in these products and policies. So those are some of the questions that we're debating, actually brainstorming to come up with new standards to incorporate into the digital standards so it can stay effective and up to date and also capture the new arising issues that we are seeing. So in my work, I don't necessarily deal with inequality on a day-to-day basis, right? My focus is on privacy and security, but there are definitely a lot of observations that I have made in terms of inequality, and I'm going to just touch upon a few of them. The one, we know that there is this significant economic and social benefit that IoT promises. I don't want to undermine that and sound very pessimistic, right? But I also see through work being involved with RDR for over a year is that there is going also to be an increased power imbalance between the companies and the users. And I think that I'm also seeing the widening of the inequality gap between the users. So, I mean, Laura, in the morning, you mentioned all these different products that have all these different sensors that give more capabilities to the companies to collect more data that is personalized, behavioral data. So that gives companies more power to actually make decisions about users. Okay, and those decisions sometimes are discriminatory decisions, they're predatory practices. Sometimes, as we're finding out from Facebook, they're trying to manipulate users. So give more information to the companies. Those practices could also, have more significant impact on people. I think this dynamic is also going to segregate the marketplace again into winners and losers, which we already have. Whether we're talking about in the financial sector or in the health sector, I think there will still be the same that we see today, like the same unfair treatment towards certain people from certain communities or socioeconomic backgrounds. And then also, I think that we all know that the increased corporate surveillance, which also enables the government surveillance, has disproportionately affected people of certain communities, whether those are journalists, advocates, LGBTQ community, or communities of color dealing with law enforcement. So I think those issues are definitely not going to minimize or go away when we talk about these new data capabilities in the IoT governance space. Another very basic and obvious inequality issue that I see, and I think everybody sees, is actually the cost, right? A lot of the products that I'm evaluating are not cheap. Some of the most useful technology is actually very cost prohibitive. They're very expensive, they're not accessible. So when we're talking about the benefits that IoT will bring, all the efficiencies that we will see in the workplaces, in healthcare, like who are the people that are going to benefit from all those? Are the people that can afford to get access to these technologies. So then you will have, again, this widening of the inequality of the people that can access and they cannot catch up with where the society is actually going in its advancements. So then one other observation that I made through a different project that I worked with RDR, it was dealing with the privacy of national identification projects, but I think it's still pertinent to the IoT space as well, is that sometimes when you design products, you unintentionally exclude people, by putting certain barriers with your design. And I'm gonna give you an example. For example, when you design a technology that requires a biometric authentication method to access it, what about people that have fingerprints or are missing a hand, for example, or have worn out fingerprints because they're manual workers? Or when you have artificial intelligent assistants that are, activated, voice activated, like, yes, you're making life much easier with people perhaps with mobility issues or reading disabilities, but you're also running the risk of excluding people that may have speech disorders. So like, as a company, you also have sort of that responsibility to think about who are you unintentionally excluding by your design decisions. One last point, because I don't have a lot of time, that I will make, which is also something, a lesson that I learned from my work, is that there is also unequal access to privacy and security. What I'm seeing is that oftentimes the products that have the better security and privacy are the products that are actually more expensive, are the products produced by the companies that have the affordances to actually do the due diligence and the privacy and security of their vendors, actually that do a really good job updating their softwares. And the products that don't do that often, are more affordable and they are less privacy and security protective. So that's all I want to leave you with. I also heard somebody at some other event mention some excellent point. I am not an expert on machine learning, but there is a question. Machine learning apparently, right, relies on a lot of data. So when you're dealing with a society where people who can afford the fancy technology, and you're feeding a lot of data into those companies that are learning from the user interactions and making decisions, is your data going to be biased towards certain, again, people that aren't using your product. So I can't answer that question, but I think it's a valid question to also think about it. And I've put together some recommendations that I don't necessarily need to go over. Those are recommendations that we've kind of synthesized from our work through the Corporate Accountability Index, but I think they equally well apply to IoT products, even though they're not necessarily comprehensive. But, a basic thing is transparency. Transparency doesn't solve issues, but if you do not have transparency, you do not understand the data cycle of a product, you do not understand what the privacy steps are taken at every single step, and then it becomes much harder to define risks and mitigate harms when they're occurring or where they can occur. So one of the recommendations we always give is more transparency, and that's the reason we want more transparency. So I'm gonna leave you with my information here. Feel free to ask me questions. And I also want to announce something very quickly, even though I know Andrew may announce that as well, is that on April 25th, Ranking Digital Rights is launching its new index results in New York City, but it's going to be live streamed at 9:30 a.m. ET. So please join us and ask me questions about that if you'd like.
Great, thank you very much, Tatevik. I look forward to being there for the lunch. That sounds exciting. So our final panelist is Professor Paul Ohm. Paul is a professor of law at the Georgetown University Law Center. He specializes in information privacy, computer crime law, intellectual property, and criminal procedure. He serves as a faculty director for the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown. In his work, Professor Ohm tries to build new interdisciplinary bridges between law and computer science. Much of his scholarship focuses on how evolving technology disrupts individual privacy. Professor Ohm began his academic career on the faculty of the University of Colorado Law School, where he served as Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and helped direct the Silicon Flatirons Center. In 2016, he was appointed by the White House to the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking. I want to hear more about that. Outstanding. From 2012 to 2013, Professor Ohm worked for the Federal Trade Commission as a senior policy advisor, and before becoming a professor, he served in the U.S. Department of Justice's Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section as an honors program trial attorney and clerk for Judge Betty Fletcher in the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and Judge Mariana Felser for the United States District Court for the Central District of California. He is a graduate of the University of California, Los Angeles Law School. And before becoming a lawyer, Professor Ohm worked for several years as a computer programmer and network systems administrator after earning undergraduate degrees in computer science and electrical engineering from Yale University. Today, he continues to write thousands of lines of Python and Perl code each year, and no R. I'm disappointed.
Oh, I dabbled in R.
All right. Professor Ohm.
Thank you. Yeah, when I use R, I feel... I'm going to sit here. Do you need me at the podium? I'll go to the podium. It's fine. Path of least resistance, that's fine. Yeah, when I use R, I'm trying to think of the right metaphor.
Okay.
I'm always astounded by the power you can accomplish with an efficient amount of code, and I always just hate myself because it's just terrible. It's a terrible coding experience. Anyway, so thank you for having me, and congratulations and thank you to Andrew and to Laura on what has been an enlightening day. I don't primarily occupy my days thinking specifically about the Internet of Things. I think a lot more about the Internet. I should also say that at one point I was slated to be on the middle panel of the day and have migrated to this panel. And so I hope you'll indulge me as I start my talk kind of in a reflection on the really stimulating conversation we saw before lunch, and then I'm going to work my way into some of the stimulating things we've already heard from my co-panelists. And so I think in many ways what I want to do is, and you should see the scattered nature of my notes. Let's see if I can bring this together. I want to raise three themes. I want to talk about the nature of harm and regulation, which is, again, what I think they were talking about before lunch. I want to kind of, if you'll indulge me, have an extended meditation on the death of efficiency, which I think we're watching right now, like a slow motion car crash. And then I want to try and land on some kind of concrete prescriptions about what do we do with the Internet of Things in particular. So let's start with harm. I think I've spent my entire career as a bit of a downer at events like this because I have a kind of fundamentally pessimistic worldview on where we are with technology. After all, I think the one concept I'm most associated with is the database of ruin, the kind of global database of the one fact about you that you don't want your worst enemy to know about. And there was a kind of gilded golden age where you didn't have to worry about that fact getting out because it was held partly by one company and partly by another company, but in essence, we should just think that all the databases of the world have come together, and the one person you most don't want to know your ruinous fact is now very, very close to knowing that if they want to put in the effort. So the database of ruin is something I was talking about in 2009, and again, I would give my talk and people would feel really depressed, and we would console one another during the break. And yet I always felt like I was a little bit on the outside of the party, where the party were the optimists who thought everything is great. This is also a funny place for me to be because I started using the internet when I was in college. I am exactly the right age where the birth of the web kind of exploded onto the scene during my undergraduate studies. I am a technologist through and through. I don't confess to writing Perl. I should probably take that out of my biography. But I write a lot of code, and I believe in the power, the transformative power of technology to really do what Adam Thierer said in that panel, is to enable human flourishing. And yet, I think we're not quite there with the way we've structured our society and our governance. I think in 2018, it's a lot easier to be a pessimist. I think in many ways, the world has come to my point of view, right? And we've heard some of this today, although in many ways, this was not the doom and gloom conference I'm used to going to this academic year, right? You go to conferences which in past years have been the celebration of technology and innovative disruption, and when we hear the name Schumpeter, we all kind of bow our heads at the greatness of the invisible hand and what he has been able to bring upon this world. For the last year at these conferences, we've heard complaints about harassment, cyberbullying, the addictive nature of our smartphones and the technology that is fed to us like little pills through it, surveillance, filter bubbles, manipulation, discrimination. It's really easier in 2018 than it used to be 2 years ago and even more 10 years ago to say that in many ways the internet is terrible. The internet has become a very vile, fraught place to be. And I say this knowing full well that Steve Crocker, who in many ways is kind of associated with a generation of people who invented the internet and we owe a great debt to, sometimes take things like I just said quite personally. I was speaking recently at a conference where Vint Cerf was in the front row, and at the end of my talk, Vint Cerf asked what the punishment for murder in that state was, and then came up to me during the reception and called me a nincompoop 14 times, which I'm trying to work into my resume because it was a highlight of my career. But in many ways, if you're with me, even in part, that there are kind of difficult and maybe even intractable problems that the state of technology has brought to us, I think it has to then also lead to the conclusion that if we have a new space, an exciting space like the Internet of Things, maybe one thing we ought not do is replicate the governance structures that brought us to the internet, right? And in many ways, I think even people like Vint Cerf will say, we weren't thinking much about security at the time, and we weren't thinking much about privacy at the time, and we were a small universe of people who trusted one another, who were kind of culturally and ethnically, and in terms of class, rather homogeneous. And so we were able to rely on things like multi-stakeholderism, standard-setting bodies, and informal forms of soft law governance that in many ways, I think, have helped lead us to where we are today. And so the last thing I want to say about that kind of, again, enlightening panel before lunch is I think that sometimes those who trumpet the horn of permissionless innovation need to be a little bit more nuanced about the types of regulations you're complaining about. I think the scourge of innovation is ambiguity, and this is why I'm so glad Cory Docterow, who I've never met personally, but I'm privileged to be on the panel with you, Cory. I'm so glad you brought up the CFAA and the DMCA. These are laws that suffer under the weight of ambiguity. The problem isn't just that security researchers aren't able to take apart their tractor and tell the tractor manufacturer what they're doing wrong. The problem is that they are freighted by standards like the word authorize, and what does that even mean? Or in the copyright space that the statute Cory referred to, 1201, has no allowance for fair use, and even if it did have an allowance for fair use, it would be hard for any lawyer in the world to tell any security researcher, here's where fair use begins and ends. And so I think what kills innovation are laws that are impossible to interpret. But I can point to examples of laws where the lines are precise and bright. So here's one that I'm going to throw out there, knowing half of you in the room, if you have heard of this, hate it. But let me just give an example of why you hate it, I think, for a different reason. The Child Online Privacy Protection Act, or COPPA, which, if you've heard of it at all, it might have been through a very good episode of the TV show Silicon Valley. COPPA restricts your ability to obtain information from children under 13 without a very overt form of parental consent. And again, there are people who hate COPPA. There are people for whom COPPA represents the reason why education is hard or great interactive apps for children is hard. But the one thing they don't complain about, I think, is I don't know where the lines are drawn. I don't know how to comply with this law. And so they're having a more genuine debate about the wisdom or lack of wisdom of the regulation, which is a debate I want to have. But they're not talking about squelching or killing innovation because of the ambiguity, the penumbra of the law. And I think it's really important that we disentangle the two. Okay, that's theme one. Theme two, and I'm going to confess, this is just a sharp left turn into something I've been thinking a lot about and want to share with you today. I haven't written up my latest thinking on this. I did, though, about 4 years ago, back when we still called it big data, before we called it machine learning and AI and whatever we're calling it today. I wrote an essay called The Underwhelming Benefits of Big Data. And I think I'll go to my grave with this having been probably the snarkiest thing I've ever written. And in this, I say, as we are about to engage on a kind of global debate over big data techniques and whether the benefits that we're talking about outweigh the costs, we have to be careful not to point to trivial benefits that we pretend are profound. And so one example I gave was OkCupid. The dating service was kind of under the crosshairs of the public because they had been releasing these blog posts that revealed tiny little tidbits of social science-like results about who we date and who we don't. And again, all of those kind of scare quotes and adjectives I put in there at the beginning are important because this wasn't academic research. They weren't really mining and discovering new truths of the essence of who we are as humans and who we seek in mates. Instead, they were just like tickling that part of our brain that likes a little bit of trivia early in the morning, right? Isn't this curious that you can say this thing about, men who look at pictures of African-American women versus white women? They weren't giving us enough to do science with it, but instead they were just kind of diverting our attention for a couple of minutes. And I said, infographics, for example, were the pollution effluent of the data age, right? They just kind of pollute our air and we act like they're important, but we should instead focus on what's truly important. Big data at the time was also touted by IBM for analyzing children born prematurely and how to save their lives. That's important. That's the kind of big data benefits we should be focusing on. We shouldn't be focusing on OkCupid. We shouldn't be focusing on Google flu trends, which, after all, now that the history has kind of been written about that, was nothing but marketing for Google and a tool they used to get a fancy publication from one of their researchers. It never helped human health in ways that Google still wants you to believe today. So let's bring this finally to the Internet of Things. And what I'm here to say is something that I think is probably easy to dismiss as just my personal preferences. I think if you think of Internet of Things as kind of innovations for things like smart cities or things that are kind of more social in nature, and if you separate those from the things you could buy on the shelves of Best Buy right down the street, thanks. I want to put out the claim that there is yet to be, in my opinion, a truly interesting and innovative Internet of Things for the consumer device on sale. Right? And so let's look at some of the ones that are always touted as revolutionary. The one that really confounds me is the Nest, right? So the Nest is a thermostat. And I don't have one, so maybe I just don't know the kind of revolutionary enlightenment and awakening I will have if I have it. But from what I can tell, it's a thermostat with a much better UX, and it's pretty, unlike most thermostats, which are usually kind of the eyesore on your house. They allow you to set the temperature of your house from anywhere in the world, although the kind of benefit of setting the temperature of your house when you're not in your house has always kind of escaped me. And maybe net, they might add a little bit to fights of kind of global warming and fossil fuel excess. Maybe, although again, I'd like to see the numbers to suggest that that's true. But fine, if there are kind of slight benefits, as I'm suggesting, surely they outweigh the downside. But of course, there are downsides to having a Nest in your house. We've already talked about a lot of these today. They are kind of a vector for attacks, as we saw from the Mirai botnet, which wasn't about Nest, but could be. They're only as good so long as the kind of cloud infrastructure that backs it up, the corporate entity that supports it, all exist. How old is the thermostat that you replaced with your Nest? Probably 20 to 25, maybe even 40 years old. Has a little bit of mercury that kind of does the job of 15,000 lines of code in the Nest. That thermostat on your wall was going to continue working for 10, 20, 30 more years. Your Nest will not work for longer than 5 years. I'm willing to make a kind of public bet about that. So are we as a society kind of enjoying benefits of this device? And even if we are they worth the countervailing costs that a device like this brings? And I think by focusing on kind of the supposed efficiencies of the Internet of Things, I'm actually joining what seems to be kind of a coalescence of lots of thinkers from around the world. So I'd refer you to Tim Wu, who wrote an op-ed in the New York Times recently called The Tyranny of Convenience. And Tim urges us to think about the virtue of frustration and failure, to resist the lulling stupefaction of every little advance that comes from Amazon and companies like them. And again, it's a kind of almost dignity and autonomy, human spirituality framed argument that I think will resonate with some of you, but probably not with all of you. The second piece of this kind of growing advocacy of inefficiency is Dan Geer. Dan Geer is a noted computer security expert. And recently for the Hoover Institution, he wrote a kind of compact little essay he called a Rubicon. And in the Rubicon, he's focusing in particular on connected devices that are also critical infrastructure. And Dan, I think he even goes so far as to say we ought to have a law that says that anything that controls critical infrastructure, should be analog and disconnected. And when he says analog, he means analog. He says we should have dials on the wall that are not connected to the internet. Those are the things that should be running our critical infrastructure. And again, because he's a serious computer security expert, does in a much more deep way than I can in 15 minutes, kind of recite the inherent security risks of doing things in the digital connected way that we have chosen to do it. Okay, finally, in the last couple of minutes, let me try and bring this to some concrete prescriptions about the Internet of Things. I feel like we're almost in a time machine and we're back in 1994 and Ethan Zuckerman has first proposed the ad banner, and we thought this is a wonderful way to kind of structure our commerce, is to create a pervasive surveillance system that feeds behavioral digital dossiers about every one of us. And because of that, creates all sorts of opportunities for permissionless innovation in garages around the world, where people are going to bring the fruits of this wonderful thing called the internet to all of us. What could possibly go wrong, right? I think where we are today is that same discussion for the Internet of Things. I think we shouldn't use the passive governance structures we use for the internet of the internet, but should think about being more proactive. Here's one really concrete proposal. We should ban Internet of Things business models that are premised on behavioral advertising. Full stop. We should say that if what you want to do is bring human flourishing and joy to people in their lives because you have a value proposition about the temperature of their home and you can convince them that it's worth $129 to buy into that, great, more power to you. But we shouldn't incentivize business models that are about extracting information about you that nobody else in the world has, because after all, that's the name of the game. The more rare the data is they can extract about you, the more sensitive it is, the more that it's going to make them money. But of course, the more sensitive it is, the more it might cause you harm. And so we have this opportunity at this moment to, in other words, treat customers as ends, not means to a different end. My colleague at Georgetown, Julie Cohen, has written a lot about how the extractive business model of the internet makes us all mediated by the choices of these companies. That Facebook famously in the last couple of weeks attention has shown on the fact that they created their news feed to privilege engagement over kind of provocation or thought or emotion, right? And engagement in many ways may have brought us to where we are today. I think the last thing I want to do, because I have a whole page of notes on this last topic, is instead just throw it up in the air as a kind of provocation that maybe we could talk a little bit more about in the Q&A. In that last panel before lunch, Gilad talked about the kind of pernicious nature of the cost-benefit analysis, and I saw that firsthand at the Federal Trade Commission. If you are not speaking the language of economics, you don't belong in the halls of the Federal Trade Commission, is what you'll often hear. I actually have an argument that I'm just going to put out there as a teaser, that the age of economics is coming to an end, at least when it comes to tech policy, and that the computer scientists of the world are going to be the way forward. And so basically I'm trying to launch an interdisciplinary war between computer scientists and economists. And guess what? The economists are far outmatched in that war, and the computer scientists will win, but I need to have a kind of full-throated recruitment effort before we can get to that point. All right, I think I've given you plenty to ask me about. Thank you very much for your time.
Great job. We want to join the war there. So I think we're going to have some questions for Cory first because of the technology. So why don't we get that set up? While we do that, Steve, did you want to ask a quick question? Looks like you wanted to jump right in while we get it set up.
I can ask my question. I don't know how quick it will be. Where's the line? Between, do we need a microphone here?
Yeah.
Thanks. I was listening to your prescription, the business models that are only intended to affect user behavior, and was trying to understand how that's different from the same argument about advertising on television pre-internet days.
So I can go on and on about this, but the fundamental difference is television advertising is fundamentally about figuring out how to appeal to a group that you're in, right? And so it incentivized lots of terrible things like reality TV, but at the end of the day, it still treated you as a member of a group. Today's internet business model is how can I isolate you and the things that will trigger your purchase, and because of that, it really has kind of led to a lot of the problems that we're talking about now with the election and with Russian interference over voting. And so yes, if we had a contextual business model for the internet that was a lot like TV, I'd be ecstatic. I think that would be a real improvement over instead what we have, which is let me find out the way to isolate you from everyone else in your sphere. Let me isolate you in some very literal way. So,
Great, thank you.
and I'm not anti-advertising. I'm just anti-behavioral advertising. I want to be clear.
So I think we've got Cory back up now. There he is.
Yep.
We'll get him on the screen there. There he is.
Aye.
So Cory, while we see if there are questions here in the hall, I had one question I wanted to start with, and I'm going to ask Tatev the same question. You raised a really interesting problem of the larger consumer production device companies producing devices that have a certain level of testing and support and so forth, and that as those start to gain market share, the knockoffs coming in that have more vulnerabilities. Are there things that you have in mind that are where you're able to deal with that particular problem? How are you thinking about securing more of these knockoff devices? Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I want to fall back to that last point that I made in my talk earlier, which is that rather than focusing on how we make things work well, which I'll leave to computer scientists who have non-honorary degrees in computer science, I want to focus on how to not make them worse. And so I think that there may be code that we could write that would improve them. There may be businesses we could found that would do it. There may even be laws that we could produce that banned certain code structures or models and so on. But we lack an evidentiary framework for exploring those, not because of a lack of regulation, but because of regulation that cuts against any kind of self-help measure, community response, or market response where individuals or collectives or firms that want to do things that might be capital intensive or require being in the public sphere where they're subject to kind of regulatory targeting and retribution or civil targeting and retribution from firms they compete with, that makes it hard for us to figure out what code we might write for those things, right? Like, you know, if you buy any commodity PC that exists today, it will probably come with a crummy commercial operating system, maybe an old version of Windows whose patches have been discontinued, that's like radioactively insecure, and you can just like stick a thumb drive in it and install Ubuntu on it, and then you get like this best of breed, super secure, hardcore operating system. Like, could we imagine people who have the same level of skill as, say, like solar roof installers, who are retrained individuals who will show up at your house and flash all your crappy devices with devices that are, you know, fully open, fully audited, or firmware that's fully open, fully audited, that may not be defect free, but at least whose defects can be freely discussed and quickly remediated by a plurality of actors in the market who might have different ideas about how to fix things? Again, that won't make it necessarily work, right? Like, we had OpenSSL out there in the world for a long time, freely auditable, and it had a ton of showstopper bugs just hanging around like a bad smell, waiting to like destroy the future, right? But I don't think anyone would argue that like the problem with OpenSSL was that it was open. I think the problem was that it wasn't adequately audited, and making it closed would not have made it easier to audit it. So I think like before, we are so far away from having the evidence for what makes things work that any prescription is pretty speculative, but we have an enormous bounty of evidence about what makes things fail. And we can take action right away on that basis. You know, in terms of like policy questions, you know, I agree that like the surveillance business model is super toxic and produces all kinds of bad outcomes. But we don't necessarily have to ban them, although maybe we will. But before we ban them, what if we just said it's against the law to subject people to binding arbitration for breaches that arise from security defects in products that have collected a bunch of data? Like, as soon as someone in the no-win, no-fee contingency bar manages to extract the full economic cost of one of those giant 80 million user breaches from some big firm, their insurers and their reinsurers are going to show up at their door and say, right, let's do an audit, right? Your premiums are going up 1,000,000%. Because we suddenly realized that what we thought you were storing was neat bundles of clean, lint-free rags for cleaning your house, and it turns out you've been storing mountains of oily rags and hoping that they won't catch fire. And insuring mountains of oily rags is expensive.
Other questions for Cory? We've got microphones in the audience. There's one. Thank you so much.
Yeah, this is Lucy Thompson. Fantastic presentation. I'm active in the American Bar Association. Is there a group of people who are working with people like Mark Warner and others on the Hill to devise some legislation that would deal with these problems that you've outlined?
You know, we have occasionally seen legislation floated that would have imposed some sanity. Whether that's changes to CFAA, especially in the wake of the suicide of Aaron Swartz, or changes to 1201, limits on 1201, they're all dead letters as far as I can tell. And, you know, we're now like leaving the realm of tech policy and entering the realm of wider policy questions, which is, you know, the difficulty of getting evidence-based policy through politics is, you know, very closely related to questions of campaign finance and inequality and things that may be out of scope, although maybe we can't solve any of these other problems until we start talking about them. You know, there is this truism that my co-panelists alluded to, that if you're not paying for the product, you're part of the product, or you are the product. That, you know, I think that's been a convenient observation where we say, well, look, the internet is like co-occurring with advertising-based business models. Advertising-based business models treat their users as the product rather than as the customers, and therefore the internet is like intrinsically somehow about treating users as products instead of customers. But what we see is that as we've kind of marched on with the phenomena that also grew up around the same time as the internet, things like lax enforcement of antitrust rules, willingness to allow firms to get very big and to command both horizontal and vertical slices of their industries and so on, is that even people who spend an enormous amount of money on the product are still the product. because of other forms of lock-in that stop them from fleeing to a rival's offer. And the poster child for this is John Deere. And so John Deere doesn't just lock farmers into getting service from John Deere service technicians, which is problematic because it means that like literally the day you want to make hay while the sun shines, you're instead twiddling your thumbs while you wait for a technician to come and punch a long integer into the console of your tractor. But they gather telemetry about your field while you plow. So they have torque sensors on the wheels, they have humidity sensors in the undercarriage, they know where they are to the centimeter, and they conduct these centimeter accurate soil condition surveys that are super useful when you're broadcasting seed. But John Deere doesn't let the farmers get that data. They have to buy that data back from John Deere as part of an app that comes with your Monsanto seed. So John Deere licenses that data to Monsanto. Monsanto sells it back to the farmers. So those farmers, they're not getting a free advertising supported tractor. They're spending $500,000 on that tractor. And so, the formulation that even if you're if you're not paying for the product, you're still the product, that's a really inadequate description. And what may be better to say is that firms in the absence of robust competition or regulation, both of which arise from regulatory and political capture, abuse their customers in every conceivable way we can enumerate, including treating them as the product, whether or not they've paid for the product.
Great, thank you. We've got another question here.
Hi, my name is Troy. I'm curious if you think that that if European regulation, the GDPR, because of the interconnectedness of networks, companies, routing, cloud services, is that going to effectively spread to the U.S. because of international? Or like in the end, are we going to, before the U.S. catches up with legislation, end up following European legislation because of interconnectedness?
Yeah, I just heard Clay Shirky make a wonderful point about this on the media last week, where he said that Germany has become to the world of privacy regulation what California is to auto emission standards. That the market is so big and so interconnected that it's the floor on how bad things can get, right? What Germans will tolerate is the worst that everyone else has to put up with. And maybe we can get better than that, but no one will have to put up with worse, because if you want to sell into Germany in the EU, you have to sell into Germany. And if you want to sell into the EU and Germany, then you're going to have to abide by their rules. And it's just impossible to untangle the rest of the world's market, especially when we're talking about communications technology, where you have a kind of inverse of what we see with the FISA courts and Section 702 and so on, where they say, well, so long as there's some nexus with a foreigner, we can spy on you all we want. This is also what's been proposed in the UK in terms of their privacy rules. And so therefore, anyone who's within one handshake of a foreigner has no privacy rights. What we see now is that anyone who's within one handshake of a German gets all the privacy rights that the EU wants to afford them. And that it's that same thing cutting across. And I think in the GDPR, we have a kind of interesting regulatory outcome that is almost sui generis, in that it is a meaningful privacy regulation that does in fact threaten the business models of the incumbents. So usually when we see regulation, the people who get the seat at the table are the incumbents. The people who don't get a seat at the table are the businesses that don't exist yet. And no one's going to make a GDPR, in theory, no one would make a GDPR that puts Facebook out of business. It's always going to be something Facebook can comply with, even if Facebook 10 years ago couldn't have complied with it, and therefore a notional competitor of Facebook that might replace it in 10 years might not be able to afford to comply with it. But what I think we see coming out of the EU is stuff that genuinely imperils the business model of some of the largest American-based tech companies. And there are people who've proposed in a kind of conspiracy-ish way that what the EU is doing is conducting trade war by another means. They're setting out to punish American tech companies. I think they're right. I think that at least some of the motivation, the reason we didn't get the same kind of crappy privacy rules that we got the last time around in the EU, when they passed that rule that said you have to tell everyone you're setting a cookie and then you're done, right? You have no more privacy obligations. The reason we didn't get that kind of feel-good, do-nothing rule is because there is an element of trade war here, and maybe reaction against Trumpism and a kind of snood cocking at Brexit and the British enthusiasm for mass surveillance and so on, that all of that has come together to produce a real toothsome, meaningful regulation for the first time in as long as I can remember. Now, with that said, I do want to point out that there's one huge problem with the GDPR from a privacy perspective that is frequently present in privacy rules, including in state privacy rules and other conceptions we have, which is that it effectively removes all your privacy duties, provided you anonymize the data before you release it or handle it or sell it on to a third party. And in computer science, there is no consensus on what constitutes a data set that has been anonymized beyond the ability of someone to do re-identification. And in Australia, the way that they answered this is by banning re-identification, which is, it's like banning looking for security defects. It just means that identity thieves alone will know which techniques work and which ones don't. And everyone else will just have to take vendors' word for it that they've sprinkled enough magic anonymization dust on the data before making it public or selling it to a third party that you are at no risk. I think that's a huge problem, and it's in the GDPR.
So it looks like our technology is working sufficiently. So Cory, if you can hang tight, we'll start to open up the questions to some of the other panelists. And before we do that, any questions online for Cory specifically? Any online questions? Who's got the... No? Okay. All right. So let's start to open it up a little bit. And Tatevik, I want to just ask you the same question I asked Cory because of your work on sort of reviewing consumer IoT products. My understanding of Consumer Reports is you really generally focus on the more, brand name, top selling devices and so forth. But are you looking at some of these knockoff products at all in your review? And is that something that you think is important to the work that you are trying to do?
Yeah, so is this, yes, just give me 1 second.
It sounds like it's on.
Yes, so I think that we don't necessarily try to just focus on mainstream products. I can't necessarily name the products that I evaluated other than the smart TVs until the results are out. But yes, we have reviewed products that are very poor in their security and privacy. And I think that sometimes when you look at their disclosures or like their structure, company structure, oftentimes it's just simple ignorance. It's just like a group of engineers got together and decided to create a product. They don't necessarily have a legal team. They haven't really put a lot of thought about other sorts of considerations. So sometimes that's just that simple. I think other times, and I'm not an economist, but I think it's really difficult to compete with the larger companies. I don't want to get into antitrust or anything, but I think the companies that have the resources have also the ability to actually leverage their own infrastructure and, their data and make the products more, cost effective for them. And so it's very hard, I think, for certain other products to compete with them.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's what I would say. And I agree with a lot of the stuff that Cory said. So I'm not an engineer, but I think there are also some other sorts of, interventions that you can think about. Like recently, last month actually, the UK government put out a report called Secure by Design. So I think they're trying, there's a lot of effort, I think, both by the governments and the industry, civil society, to get these sorts of companies to be aware of the basic standards and privacy and security that they need to take into consideration. So I think awareness will solve the first type of issue that I was mentioning. The market issue is a larger issue. I don't really know, what needs to be done.
And just before you turn the mic, in your review, are any of your assessments also looking at anything related to accessibility for persons with disabilities for IoT products?
No, we are not looking at that. We did look at that when we were at RDR. We were reviewing another project on digital identification, and we saw that accessibility is actually a huge issue when you look at different countries. And some of those issues that I highlighted with the design are also relevant. So I easily see them, being applicable to the IoT, but I do not assess.
Okay.
I primarily focus on privacy and security.
Okay, great. And Paul, so you said something very, very striking to me when you essentially, to paraphrase, you said that when we think about governance for IoT, that we should think about different governance mechanisms that we use for governing the internet. Can you say a bit more about what you see as governance mechanisms for IoT?
I think is this working? Yes. I think I'm thinking of, so we need a multi-stakeholder institution where the voices of marginalized communities can sometimes be heard, where public advocates could sometimes be heard. I can think of something that seems to have worked along some of these lines, which is democracy. And so when I think of sensible alternatives to the governance of the internet, I think of governance. I think of governments, right? Going right back to where Laura started us with the beginning of the day. I mean, I have a skepticism about
you can tell that.
Yes, I have a skepticism generally, that should just be the bumper sticker on my car, but about the multi-stakeholder turn. And I say that knowing there are a lot of really interesting thinkers in the room who have devoted a lot of time and energy into those processes. But, you know, I was on the sidelines of watching some of what Larry Strickling was doing with privacy at the NTIA, where there was just an enormous churn of activity extending years and years and years. And in a funny way, these worked as almost a distributed denial of service attack on private advocates, right? On these servants at nonprofits who were forced to buy plane tickets to go to places that they could scarcely afford because the corporate members of the multi-stakeholder body were going to be there, and it took them away from fighting other fights. I mean, Cory was on the front lines of watching what the W3C was doing over 1201, over DRM. I was one of the FTC's observers at what the W3C was doing around Do Not Track. And so I'm skeptical that either multi-stakeholderism in the kind of newer way or in the traditional internet standards way is the path to solving some of the problem. It's great for some things.
So if I could push you just a little bit,
Sure.
a little bit more on this, Paul. So,
Yeah.
so if you look at that vision that you described of what that vehicle might look like,
Yeah.
do you, and there's a pretty robust debate right now in the future of the IGF and where it should go. But these IoT discussions have been very robust within the IGF and within the MAG. And you do have the sort of one place where you can go without having to go to all the other places where industry leaders might be, where you have this multi-stakeholder gathering of people who are, thinking deeply about these issues. So do you see that as in no way being able to help facilitate this governance of IoT? Or, people, sometimes say if there was no IGF, you'd have to create it. And 12 years on, what do you see about that as a particular governance vehicle?
And I want to be really careful and not talk too much about specific institutions that I just don't know enough about. So let me say that as the first thing. The very last thing I started to mutter at the end of my last comment was, I think for certain types of problems, these institutions have proved their worth, right? So if you're talking about technical interoperability, TCP/IP is a kind of crowning achievement of the history of mankind, right? And so we shouldn't forget that multi-stakeholderism works, in fact, we didn't call it multi-stakeholderism at the time, works to solve particular types of problems. But I think that when these organizations are now being asked to solve problems that are freighted with human value, it just starts to make a lot less sense. And so when we think about things like rural farmers trying to eke out a living in a very complicated economic environment, or we try and think about consumer autonomy and choice when they want to just surf the web and buy their stuff and not have to be tracked the entire time. I'm not sure why either of those debates landed in the W3C, and I'm not terribly surprised that those in the Do Not Track case just never went anywhere, and in the DRM case led to maybe the worst possible result, right? So sure, these groups should exist and continue to do, even on IoT questions, discussions about lots of the important questions that need to be solved. But we shouldn't ask them to answer all of our questions.
Right.
They're going to fall flat.
So as you said it, what struck me was, and I know Laura probably, she and I've talked a lot about this, but so if you look at some of the technical issues that you talked about, a lot of that really doesn't happen in the IGF. Some people say there is no governance that happens in the IGF. It's happening in the W3C and the IETF and all these other venues where the technical standards are being debated and discussed. It sounded to me a little bit like, given what you were discussing, that IGF actually might be a very interesting place to think about these issues, because it's not just the technical side. It's all these other issues. Questions, comments? Yes.
I'm next in the queue.
Oh, you're in the queue.
Yeah, you thought I was just holding the mic, and then that'll be the next question after that. And so my question is primarily for Paul. So let's say I am convinced, which I am actually, that a life of connected things is too distractible and perhaps not a full life. So I want to join the Church of Paul Ohm, and now but I need some devices to sometimes talk to the internet.
Yeah.
I also need there to be devices that work still for me. And so I think Maryland is one of the states, certainly Pennsylvania. It has rules for the Amish. They're allowed to take their vehicles on the road. Yeah. And so who is going to pass these rules so that those of us who actually are not so crazy about all of this connected stuff, but still sometimes need to deal with this world? Is that going to be government? Is that going to be your multi-stakeholder organization? Who's going to let us get our buggies on the information superhighway without getting run down?
I mean, so there's two questions in there, right? What should the rules be that'll allow, like, call me a Luddite if you want, right? The neo-Luddites to still take part in the connected world some of the time. And then the second question is, and who is in the best position to come up with those rules? I actually think the second question is harder, and it's going to take a long debate to disentangle the benefits of, let's just be very American-centric, liability regimes like Cory talked about, the US Congress, which for those of you who are under 25 used to be a body that created these things called laws, or expert administrative agencies. So that's a harder one, and I think we could debate that. But let me just talk about the substantive one, right? So let's have a rule that requires sensible defaults, right? And so that the world by default is not part of the kind of behavioral advertising ecosystem that I was decrying, and anyone who wants to be part of that world can opt in, right? So flip the default from what we have right now, which is the only way you can get privacy is if you fight, claw, scratch for it in an opt-out regime, and that's in the best case. Sometimes there's no opportunity to opt out. And let's just flip the default. This is what the FCC's broadband privacy rule, may she rest in peace, did, which was flip the default when it came to what Comcast can do to look at your internet traffic. That substantively would have been a profound change, and unfortunately got unrolled by this current Congress. So.
Thanks, Paul. Question here?
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. After I listened to all these sessions, I have an impression that we are not really put the effort how to correct our problem. I try to think about our history. We have a science, we have innovation throughout the history, but there's no such things as the way we are talking about. We are not talking about how to fix the problem, instead how to protect properly those for profit or something. I'm thinking of most recently, we are so talking about, let's say, for instance, sexual harassment. If you have someone who's raised a sexual harassment, the senators maybe have to resign this evening. But we are talking about discrimination complaint, employment complaint. You take century, almost century, still no any resolution. So somehow it's wrong. And if you are thinking about economic is not important or not relevant, I think that's totally misleading, because if you have no cost effectiveness or cost benefit analysis, that's how the whole thing goes wrong. I think that one probably Connie Rice is wrong is because she abolished the economic department basically. So the things basically we had to go to the essential concept rather than innovation. You have to invent a new terminology so you can drag the litigation for a century and still no resolution. And so I just wonder if we can put this concept. I think just internet things, probably the beginning is for Defense Department to benefit the public interest rather than to remove the whole thing interest to the private sector. Now private sector want to have the government pay the whole thing to subsidize private.
So
I think we have to
let's see if we can get a response. I think would be great.
Yeah, and I want to be clear about one thing, because you brought up my not subtle broadside attack on everyone with an economics degree. And I did that intentionally to be provocative. Let me be clearer. now that you've invited me to expand on that, which I appreciate. When I say economics, I'm actually not referring to the honest discipline that employs millions of Americans every day who do important work and are an essential part not only of our corporations but also of our government, right? That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is a stranger version of economics, and it's hard, and again, maybe you've been in the trenches too, it's hard to appreciate how in government, unless you're willing to talk about a form of economics that kind of held sway in the 1970s, an unreconstructed Chicago school, rational actor form of economics that the rest of the discipline has been working really hard to discredit ever since. It's hard to understand that today in the government, if you don't speak that 40-year-old version of economics, you're actually not listened to. And so at the federal, and I know that sounds like an exaggeration. It is absolutely not an exaggeration. So at the Federal Trade Commission where I worked, wonderful people, an amazing agency, and one that's actually not captured. It's really an interesting case study, but at the same time, there is an office full of these kind of economists who you have to justify every argument you have in their language, in their unreconstructed 40-year-old version. You're not allowed to talk about, philosophy. You're not allowed to talk about sociology. You're not allowed to talk about psychology. At the end of the day, if it's not a cost versus a benefit, and if it's not expressed in dollars, to be really candid, then it's not something that we're supposed to weigh as a government. And it may be that that's a legitimate view of government, but I think it's unhealthy if it's the only view of government, right? There's no discourse between disciplines right now in tech policy. If you're not speaking CBA, cost-benefit analysis, of course they like to call it BCA, benefit cost analysis, then you're not even given a ticket to enter the discourse. And I'm sure that it's less true in other countries. I'm only talking about the United States here. It's quite frustrating to me, and it's a big problem. It's a source of a lot of the problems I think that we have in regulation.
So before we turn to closing comments from our panelists, starting with Cory, any last questions from the audience or from online? Yes.
I'll present it kind of in somewhat provocative kind of question. You've said that Germany has a very strong appreciation for individual privacy rights, and that's true. And especially for Internet of Things, I want to know if there's anyone who's doing research on what would be the best way to resolve a certain problem that deals with a certain item that could be integrated into Internet of Things, but there's a strong culture, or at least a strong political feedback against putting this in any sort of electronic or computer integrated system. Guns, and more particularly technologies that would key a gun to a specific owner. There are technologies that actually do that. The actual product that's available that works pretty well is a German-made gun that cannot be fired by anyone except the owner by some sort of technological means. Though this particular product very vehemently is not available in the US for political reasons. How would you view this in the Internet of Things kind of discussion, both for privacy, individual privacy rights, as well as social systems of where we want a secure and safe society?
So I think Cory would like to take a crack at that first. Go ahead, Cory. Say something? No. You didn't mute yourself?
We think it's you.
Okay. They're saying it's on your side. No. Anybody else want to take a crack while we were trying to work him out?
I mean, that's a difficult
Is it difficult?
question.
How about this? Can you hear me
good,
now?
good,
yeah.
Okay, you got it now, yeah. All right.
Yeah, there we go.
Cory said he's up for it, so.
All right. Yeah, so in my remarks earlier, I said that I'm going to elide the computer science questions and just talk about the policy question. But this is a time where it's worth talking about like what computers can and can't do. So when we say we have a gun that can only be fired by its owner, what we mean to say is we have a gun that is designed to only be fired by its owner. That is a totally separate proposition to whether or not anyone other than its owner can fire it. Now, I should declare an interest here. I'm a Canadian who spent 13 years in the United Kingdom before moving to California. Guns scare the hell out of me. I can't understand the American attitude towards guns, but I do know a little about computer science. And so as much as I think guns are an important issue and also like a third rail in American politics, I also think that like wanting it badly is not enough, in the same way that crypto backdoors and other issues where someone starts from the premise, if we could get some technology to do a thing that we don't know how to make it do, things would be better. That's true, right? Like if I could swim underwater and not get wet, the world would be a better place. I don't know how to do that. It's kind of an interesting Goduncan experiment, but it doesn't tell you anything about like the reality or plausibility of it. So what I want to say about guns that can only be fired by their owners is that when we say we have a gun that can only be fired by its owner, what we mean is we have an automated gun robot that has some code in it that is designed not to be overridden or inspected or terminated by the user that tries to authenticate the user. Any code that can run in the privileged mode, this unique privileged mode of code that is not supposed to be overridden by the user, so that, you know, bad guys can't change the gun to allow it to be fired by them and not the gun's owner. Any code that can masquerade as that code or that can run in its privileged zone is by definition not detectable or terminatable by the user. So now what we have is a murderous robot that is designed not to be overridden by the person who's holding it. And that is a terrible idea on its face, however you think about guns.
All right. So you got a squinched up face from your questioner here. But while you have the microphone, Cory, any closing comments you'd like to make on governing the Internet of Things?
Sure. So I like to think about governance in the kind of Larry Lessig framework. I, grew up at his knee there. And Larry says that there's 4 forces that regulate our world. There's code, what's technologically possible; law, what's legal; markets, what's profitable; and norms, what we consider to be adequate or good behavior in the world. And when we talk about problems with technology, there is this idea that the answer to the machine can't possibly be another machine. And we tend to sweep code off the table and dismiss it with this idea of solutionism. But the reality is that the problem that we're in right now, we're in because unaccountable engineers who don't think about ethics can write a few lines of code and change the lives of billions of people. And when we think about answers to that, those answers should, in addition to markets, in addition to law, and in addition to ethical interventions, should include the ability of technologists to write code that changes the lives of billions of people for the better, to assist the people around them, to take control of their technology rather than being controlled by their technology, to patch, to change, to alter, to reconfigure, to inspect, to publish, to explain, to argue about the technologies. And it's a bit anodyne in technology circles. I mean, Richard Stallman, came up with his 3 freedoms of the freedom to inspect the code, the freedom to change the code, the freedom to distribute your changes, so long ago. He composed them in cuneiform, but we've lost sight of that amidst this valid critique of techno-triumphalism. And we've decided that if techno-triumphalism can get us somewhere bad, then we should just stop talking about technology as part of the solution. And technology has to be part of the solution. Ad blockers are the largest consumer revolt in human history. People with no particular technological expertise have, in the tens of millions, decided what is and isn't acceptable, what business models can and can't work. In addition to the GDPR, in addition to liability rules, in addition to the normative discussion about privacy, the ad blockers have been such a critical intervention that they're doing work that none of those other things could do on their own. And so let us keep that in mind as we talk about answers.
Cory, thank you. Tatev, any closing comments?
Sure, I'll make a comment about multi-stakeholderism. I have had the experience to work for a summer, do my Google fellowship at Global Network Initiative. And I want to say that I think it very much depends how effective a multi-stakeholder governance can be. its effects will depend what sorts of issues you are addressing. So I think if you look at the global GNI, Global Network Initiative, it's been pretty good at getting the companies to actually make structural changes in civil liberties, right? How they handle data or content in terms of government surveillance and government requests to take down content. I think it's much harder to have an effective multi-stakeholderism when the involved industry, whatever you're trying to resolve is really against their business interests, then they have no incentive, like you mentioned TNT. So I don't think that it's a bad model. I just think that it depends. It will be effective in certain areas and not necessarily in others. And I definitely want to reiterate the idea that the business model is definitely, going back to what Paul was saying, is definitely an issue. Looking at Facebook, the misinformation, I think it all comes down to the business model. But if you remove the advertising, I still don't think that necessarily you're going to solve all the issues. For a fact, you're not going to solve the issues that deal with security vulnerabilities, which is increasing in the IoT space. But also there's the question of, if we're moving into this data, into this world where data is the commodity, whether you're doing advertising or not, there's also the question what types of risks and harms will be embedded internally when a company makes decision, even if it's not doing any advertising, right? So there are still risks. But I want to end on a positive note and say, let's all do the work that we do, and hopefully one step at a time, make good decisions.
Keep breathing. Breathe in, breathe out. Paul, you get the closing.
Yeah, that's
closing
always
word.
dangerous. I could try and swerve toward first principles, but let me instead go the other way and state something really concrete that I've heard a little bit today. So whenever I've thought about the Internet of Things, and this connects to my kind of little screed about why is the Nest special, I'm curious that no one took me up on that in the Q&A. I'd like to hear about it afterwards. One thing that I proposed, and I think lots of people have come to the solution, but I gave it a cool name, is just a lobotomy switch. That any time you're going to program something smart into something that we might want for a long time, like a thermostat or a television, you have to have the capability to disable all smart functionality anytime the consumer wants. And it should be something that's easy to do, seamless, and preferably air-gapped. And so when I think about smart TVs, my father-in-law bought one, and I thought, you should not buy a smart TV. You should buy a dumb TV and something you attach to the HDMI port that makes it a smart TV. Because guess what? The day you see the headline in the Wall Street Journal about how it's wiretapping you, you can just yank that cable and know where you are. What's the problem with that prescription? You can't buy a dumb TV anymore. I've tried. Right. They don't sell them anymore. That's a fundamental problem. And that might be a more modest, instead of all the bomb throwing I've been trying to do for the last hour, a more modest prescription is there could be a consumer protection agency that says, if you're going to release a long-lived smart technology, you have to have a lobotomy switch. And I like the idea of ending my talk on the words lobotomy switch. Thank you.
Let's give our panelists a round of applause. And I also would just like to quickly announce, I know one of our audience members is having a meeting called the Internet of Things National Institute, May 9th through 10th. So I think she's passed out some flyers. And I'll turn it back over to Andrew.
Thank you all very much for coming, and I just want to thank all our speakers and our chair people again. And then two things before you go. One is just going to remind you of the Ranking Digital Rights report that's coming out, which Tatev spoke about. And the other is an event here, but only once I've got the details up for you. Let me see if I can get them to put that on the big screen, but it's essentially Monday the 16th in SIS 300. We're going to be having a roundtable on intellectual property and the Internet of Things. This guy called Andrew Renz is going to be presenting his research there. Apparently it's quite interesting, so I'm told. So we'd like you to come along. So thank you all very much. I think there's probably coffee outside. If you do have time to chat briefly afterwards, that'd be great. Thank you. Bye.
Yes. Well done.
We've got this up.
And also Jeffrey Madison and his teams are great.
Yes.
Yes.